In this video, I'll be taking a look at the battleship. I'm going to show how they're currently overpriced, they're underpowered, and they're an absolute poor excuse for a naval combat ship. To prove my points, I'm going to show statistical data plots of thousands of battles. And for those of you who absolutely adore that big metal monster, do not fret. By identifying these specific problems, the adjustments become very clear. The battleship, as shown in the out-of-box rules, with its absurd cost of 20, there's an attack value of 4, and there's a defense value of 4. Bloodbath has made a change to these numbers. An undamaged battleship remains with the attack and defense at 4, but a damaged one is reduced to the attack and defense at 2. This means that we're going to need to look at both models to be able to make an accurate comparison. The foundation of how to balance the cost effectiveness of the warship is the destroyer. Now, from the destroyer, we can gauge what should be the next upgrade in a combat warship, and that is the cruiser. In my previous video, I go over in detail why the cost of the cruiser needs to be set at 10. I suggest you watch that video, or you can just blindly accept that cruisers should be worth 10 and not 12. The icon in the above right is a link to that video. With both the destroyer and the cruiser set with regards to their cost, to their strengths, and to their special capabilities, they can now be used as a foundation for fixing that poorly treated monster of the seas, the battleship. And of course, the often taken, most incredible technology of the super battleship. Let's take a look at builds with equal cost values. Destroyers at 8, battleships at 20. With an IPC build of 40, that's going to give us 5 destroyers and 2 battleships. Now let's take a look at the combat effectiveness. The out-of-box rules are going to have the battleships attack and defend at 4, regardless of being damaged. The destroyers attack at 2 for a total of 10 combat points, where the battleships are at 4 for a total of 8 combat points. Which side wins this engagement? You ready? This battle is won 68% of the time by the destroyers with 2 remaining units. Now this is the plot distribution for every 1,000 times this battle is run. In this case, both the mode and the average fall at 68%. Now let's take a look at the combat effectiveness for the bloodbath rules perspective. The BBR rules will have the battleships attack and defend at 4, but they get reduced to an attack and defense at 2 when they're damaged. This definitely is going to have a negative impact towards any cost effectiveness of a battleship. The destroyers attack at 2 for a total of 10 combat points. This remains unchanged. But the battleships are at 4 for a total of 8 combat points, where they quickly get reduced to an attack of 2 for a total of 4 combat points. And this averages to 6 combat points, which is a 2-point drop from the out-of-box rules. Which side's going to win this engagement? Are you ready? This battle is won 71% of the time by the destroyers, again, with 2 remaining units. Here's the plot distribution for this battle. You'll notice that the mode is at 72. Let's take a look at builds with equal cost values. Cruisers are at 10, battleships at 20. With an IPC build of 40, that's going to give us 4 cruisers and 2 battleships. Now let's see how the cruisers stack up to the challenge. This is the out-of-box rules where the battleships attack and defend at 4 regardless of being damaged. Now which side's going to win this engagement? I'm very curious. Are you ready? The battle is won 64% of the time by the cruisers with 1 remaining unit. This is the plot distribution for the battle. You'll see that both the mode and the average are at 64%. Now let's repeat the same battle using the bloodbath rules where the battleships attack and defend at 2 when damaged. We already know which side's going to win this engagement. But what's interesting is the bump and win percentage. Are you ready? This battle is won 72% of the time by the cruisers with 1 remaining unit, just like last. Here's the plot distribution for the battle. You'll notice that the mode and the average stay at 72%, and overall there's an 8% decrease by the battleships. Now let's review. There are equal IPC values between the destroyers versus the battleships and the cruisers versus the battleships. The destroyers priced at 8 and 10 respectively, and the battleships are at 20. Destroyers win 68% of the time, and they win at 72% when utilizing the bloodbath rules. The cruisers were at 64%, and they went up to 72% with the bloodbath rules. Now, all of the plot distributions show that the battleships fail to even compete. Let's do another round of builds with equal cost values. Destroyers at 8, battleships correctly priced at 16. With an IPC build of 32, that's going to give us 4 destroyers and 2 battleships. Now things get interesting. This is the out-of-box rules where the battleships attack and defend at 4 regardless of being damaged. Which side's going to win this engagement? Previously it was destroyers at 68 with 2 units. Are you ready with this one? This battle's won 58% of the time by the battleships with 1 remaining. Here's the plot distribution for the battle. You'll notice that both the mode and the average are at 58. Now let's repeat the same battle using the bloodbath rules where the battleships attack and defend at 2 when damaged. Do you know who's going to win this battle? The battleships won the last engagement at 58, but now the BBR is going to throw a wrench into it and drop the combat strength. Are you ready? This battle is won 53% of the time, ouch, by the destroyers with 1 remaining unit. Here's the plot distribution for the battle. You'll notice that the mode and the average are at 53, and that's an 11% decrease by the battleships. And remember, this is at a cost of 16. Now let's do another destroyer round of builds with equal cost values. But this time, we're going to give the destroyers a 2-to-1 advantage. Destroyers at 8, battleships at 16. With an IPC build of 48, that's going to give us 6 destroyers and 3 battleships. In this battle, the destroyers have a 2-to-1 advantage. If the destroyers met any other ship at 2-to-1, it would be a clear win based on quantity over strength. This is the out-of-box rules where the battleships attack and defend at 4 regardless of being damaged. So which side's going to win this engagement? At 2-to-1, I'm pretty excited to find out the results. Are you ready? 60% win by the battleships at 1.5 remaining with 1 and 1 damaged. Ooh. So here's the plot distribution. Interesting. This is still a 2-to-1 advantage in quantity for the destroyers. However, this is the bloodbath rule set where the battleships attack and defend at 2 when they're damaged. Which side's going to win this engagement? Let's see, the battleships won the last fight at 60%, but the BBR rules will drop that number. But by how much? Are you ready? The battle is won at 57% by the battleships with a damaged battleship remaining. Ooh, that was close. Very close. Here's the plot distribution for the battle. 57%. You'll get the win, but you are going to be damaged. Now it's time for the cruiser round of builds with equal cost values. The cruisers at 10, battleships at 16, with an IPC build of 50. Now that's going to give us 5 cruisers and 3 battleships. The battleship total is actually 48, but that's close enough. In this battle, the cruisers are at a 5-to-3 advantage. I expect the cruisers to win against these kinds of ship odds. based on its strength and the +2 quantity. However, this is a battleship group, which should be a better class of combat vessel. This is the out-of-box rules where the battleships attack and defend at 4 regardless of being damaged. So let's take a look. Which side's going to win the engagement? Ready? This battle's won 71% of the time by the battleships, with 1 full battleship and 1 damaged. This is the plot distribution for the battle. The cruisers are at a 5-3 advantage, but this is the bloodbath rule set, where the battleships attack and defense at 2 when damaged. So which side's going to win this engagement? The previous battle was at 70% for the battleships. How far down does that number fall? Are you ready? This battle is won 53% of the time by the cruisers with 2 remaining units. Here's the plot distribution. That's a 23% drop in combat ability by the battleships. 23. And don't forget that this is the battleship with a cost at 16. Now let's review. There were equal IPC values between the destroyers versus the battleships and the cruisers versus the battleships. The destroyers were priced at 8 and 10 respectively, and the battleships were correctly priced at 16. Against the destroyers, battleships win 58% of the time. This makes sense, as a battleship should be a better combat ship. The destroyers win at 53% when you utilize the bloodbath rules. Something's gone terribly wrong there. Battleships' win percentage increases as you increase their quantity, and they go down to 57% as soon as you apply the bloodbath rules. With 3 battleships, you have firepower, but in the end, the results are still close with only 1 surviving battleship on average. The battleships win the cruiser engagement 71% of the time, given a 3 quantity. But the cruisers win out at 53% when you apply the bloodbath rules. Now, just like destroyers, there's a clear problem with the BBR castration of battleship power. 2 primary problems are identified. Number 1, the battleship's cost-effective price is at 16 and not 20 IPCs. And number 2, the bloodbath rule set reduces the strength of the battleship down to the attack and defense of 2 when it's damaged. This increases the strength of the swarm tactics, and it effectively removes the battleship from the game. Even at 16 IPCs, it's not worth the cost. You can do more with and are stronger with any mixed 2-unit combination of destroyers or cruisers than you are with a single battleship. Literally never buy it. I want to tell you about some of the finer points on the cost-effective breakdown. Destroyers versus the cruisers and the destroyers versus the battleships. At a 3-to-2 ratio, the destroyers outspending the cruisers, they can win at 70% of their engagements. Now, because of the cost change, this means that the destroyer-only group must both spend more money and have more quantity. When cruisers were at 12, you had an equal expenditure, but you would get a higher combat return for your destroyers. That's why the destroyer swarm is so effective at Axis and allies. The cost-effective levels are just wrong. At a 4-to-3, the destroyers can still swarm, but at a significant drop. 10% is a big drop. The reason is that the cost of the cruiser is at 10 IPCs. The quantity disparity is lower. There are 3 cruisers in this group. That leads to a drop in the gain by the swarm tactics. This hurts the swarm tactic, which basically wants to hit your low naval numbers having a higher quantity. This higher quantity as the swarm accounts for more potential hits. Having 4 destroyers, they could potentially hit 4 times. By lowering the cost of the cruisers, this potential begins to wane, simply because the quantity of the cruisers go up, while still spending less or the same amount as the swarming destroyers. The swarming tactic is still viable, but it's only in smaller groups, and now you have to spend more IPCs than your opponent. At a 5 to 4 is where the potential hit by the +1 destroyer is balanced by the strength of the cruiser at 3. This is the point where the cruiser begins to surpass the destroyers. You'll notice that the costs are now equal. The numbers show that the swarm tactic is highly effective at a 2 to 1 ratio and at lower numbers of ships. So this actually, if you look into it, this actually means that the mixed build of destroyers and cruisers would outclass the basic DD swarm, because now a cruiser plus a destroyer would be better than 2 destroyers. Let's move on to battleships. Against the battleship at a 2 to 1, the destroyers don't fare as well, but 55% is quite close. We should expect the battleship to have a slight edge. It's not going to come out undamaged, and it may actually be destroyed, but it's an equitable loss of IPCs when they're properly priced, 16 versus 16. Now the numbers show that the swarm tactic against battleships is most effective at a 3 to 1 ratio. But as with the cruisers, the more naval vessels, the lower the odds of a DD swarm to be effective. With a 4 to 2 ratio, you would expect better results than at 2 to 1, simply because the battleship can soak up an extra hit while they keep their strength at 4. This shows itself again at 6 to 3. The battleship can hold its own against an equal valued force. The overall target for a DD swarm tactic against a group of battleships jumps highly in the swarm's favor, but at a 3 to 1 ratio. That's a costly ratio. If you're going to use the DD swarm tactic, then this is your highest performance mark. In general, more expensive combat ships should mean better combat ships. I'm not talking about aircraft carriers, I'm talking about actual combat ships. Submarines are powerful hunters when they're using that target select. Destroyers are required to defeat the submarine, and they also have a combat advantage over them. Cruisers are missing something. They can be a better combatant than the destroyer, but they need an edge to do so, or the numbers. And I'm going to discuss that in a moment. Battleships are just powerful combatants, and they're more effective than the subs, destroyers, and the cruisers. Combined arms. This is the edge that the cruiser needs to be a more effective combatant than the destroyer, and to give it more cost-effective value. A cruiser combined with a battleship, 1 to 1, gains the ability to defend at 4. This needs to be changed so that the attack and defense at 4 when combined with a battleship. And now I'm going to show you why this works so well and why it keeps the balance. Let's test the combined arms for the cruiser. I showed earlier how a mix of destroyers and cruisers are a better combat group than a full group of only destroyers. Now when you add a battleship to the mix, then the strongest, most cost-effective naval combat group is the mix of all three, the destroyer, cruiser, and battleship. These are the costs, but we're going to keep the IPC at a low of 34. Now that gives us 5 destroyers for a total of 40 IPCs, because we want to keep the quantity up +1 for the destroyers, versus 1 of each type on the other side. Let's see. Here are the combined arms results. With 5 destroyers against a 3-ship traditional naval build, that's a 5 to 3 ratio. This also means that the swarm group now has to spend more IPCs to try to get that +2 quantity for a higher chance of potential hits. Out of the box rules gives the destroyers a 57% win rate. The Bloodbath combined arms changes this and gives the balanced build a 55% win rate. Now that's a very large 12-point swing. 55% is still close, but the edge goes to the traditional balanced build over that of the DD Swarm. A balanced build is a more cost-effective build than a 5 to 3 DD Swarm attack. Let's ratchet up these combined arm results. We are going with 7 destroyers instead of 5. We will add 1 battleship to the traditional naval build. So we are moving from a 5 to 3 ratio to a 7 to 4. That gives a +3 quantity advantage to the DD Swarm. This also means that the Swarm group is still spending more IPCs than the traditional build group. The out-of-box rules gives the destroyers a 58% win rate. The Bloodbath Combined Arms gives the balanced build a 54% win rate. Now that's still a 14-point swing. 14. 54% means that the battles are still competitively close. However, it still holds that a balanced build is more cost-effective than a 7-4 DD Swarm. In case you're wondering where the DD Swarm tactical number falls against that combined arms bump, it's right here at 8-4. As I said before, the Swarm is still a viable tactic, but now you need to outspend your opponent to get that higher quantity of potential hits. That's a better balance. I want to summarize what needs to be done to balance the naval combat vessels in the game. The destroyer is the basis on which I tested and balanced the cost and strength across the other combat ships. This led directly to the cruiser's proper cost-effective value that needs to be set at 10. Now together, both the destroyer and the cruiser led to the proper cost-effective value of a battleship being set at 16. Bloodbath rules for the combined arms needs to change so that the cruiser gets it for both attack and defense. This also necessitates that the building of a battleship is required for this. Now the Bloodbath rules for battleship reduction in combat strength for a damaged battleship at 2 needs to be removed. The battleship is made to take a beating in a heavyweight fight. It needs to stay at 4. Now applying these 4 specific changes to the game will end up giving every ship a cost-effective value and lower the strength of the swarm tactic. The other option is that you can live with what we currently have. Number 1, never build a battleship. Number 2, build destroyers instead of cruisers. And number 3, build more destroyers.